If I get to see, there it is. Good morning. Today, Thursday, February 20th, 2025. It is my distinguished honor to become the host of this joint Senate and House transportation hearing regarding the report and analysis on options for transportation emissions and reductions. I believe that Secretary Julie Moore is going to start us off, and we'd certainly welcome you to come right up and get us going this fine morning.
Thank you. So for the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm joined this morning by Jane Lazorchak, who heads our Climate Action Office, and I believe will at least be available to answer questions after some initial presentations. And so as I suspect many of you are aware, the 2024 Transportation Bill directed ANR in partnership with AOT and then in coordination with the Treasurer's Office and the Climate Council to undertake a study to evaluate the pros, cons, costs, and benefits of Vermont participating in a cap and invest program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to have a Cap and Invest 101 as part of this conversation this morning. I think it'll come after you hear the Treasurer's recommendation. So just want to level set for anyone unfamiliar with what a Cap and Invest program is, that the intention is to set a limit on the amount of pollutants, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions, and that limit declines over time. That's the cap. In order to reach that cap or achieve that cap, the state auctions allowances and then use the revenue generated from the sale of those allowances to reduce or to invest in measures and programs that further reduce emissions. We participate in a regional cap and invest program, or a type of cap and invest program right now called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is focused on the electricity sector. But this would be focused on, at least in part, the transportation sector. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Following the Treasurer's discussion of his recommendations, AOT, Jane, and our consultant, Cambridge Systematics, will provide more detail on how a cap and invest program works. The study we completed evaluated cap and invest program options that include linking with other states' existing or proposed programs. And there's really two. One is the Western Climate Initiative, which has already been implemented in California and Quebec. And the other is the New York Climate Initiative, which is under development by New York State at this point. Our study also looked at the viability of a cap and invest program that was specific to the transportation sector, which was the direction provided in the T-bill, as well as looking at an all fuels or an economy-wide, it's sometimes called cap and invest program, that would cover not only transportation, but also thermal emissions, so how we heat our buildings, as well as a third variant there, which covers transportation, thermal, and major stationary sources of emissions. And there are less than 10 of those in the state. And I'm sure Jane could let you know exactly who those are. But it tends to be fuel-intensive commercial businesses and industrial processes. We worked with our consultant team to develop draft work products. Those work products were then reviewed by a technical advisory group that included both climate counselors and interested subcommittee members. And drafts of our technical analysis were shared with the Treasurer's Office starting last fall. The final technical analysis was passed over to the Treasurer's Office last month so that they could review the cost and revenue projections and then make the recommendation. You will hear from them momentarily regarding viable options for a cap and invest program for Vermont. So I'm happy to take any questions, but just wanted to provide a little bit of that bigger context, knowing the presentation's a little bit out of order to accommodate schedules. And we will get that cap and invest 101 for folks who may not be familiar with that as a regulatory construct.
Thank you very much for the overview. Do we have questions or comments from anyone?
Thank you.
I guess we'll go right on through. Thank you very much, Secretary. And now we'd like to welcome the Vermont State Treasurer, Mike Pieciak, up to the witness stand. Good morning. It's your show from here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the time and appreciate the joint committee as well being able to address you all together. So as the Secretary mentioned, we completed an analysis of the technical analysis and looked at viable options that were available to Vermont for a cap and invest program. We, not the technical analysis really determined that Vermont was not in a position to go it alone on a cap and invest program. It really left either the Western Climate Initiative, as Julie mentioned, or New York State as possible options. There really were no other options that are being developed across the country at this point. So we looked at those two options in terms of what would be the price impact, what would be the revenue impact, what might be viable in light of both an operating program and a program in New York that is in the process of becoming operational potentially by 2027, it seems is the earliest date. And when we looked at those two options, it really determined that at this moment, the Western Climate Initiative wasn't a viable option and that we should be looking toward New York as a possible partner. And there are really three reasons that underpin that, and then a couple of recommendations that further underpin that. But the three recommendations as to why we thought New York would be a better partner than the Western Climate Initiative. One was that New York would be at the beginning of a program. The Western Climate Initiative has implemented their program over a decade ago. So they started at a lower price point in terms of the direct impact on consumers, and then have ramped that up slowly over time. So we would be joining the Western Climate Initiative midstream. The impact in terms of the gasoline impact as of now would be about 26 cent per gallon impact on consumers. For home heating fuel, it'd be more like 30 cents per gallon. And there's an inflationary rider in the Western Climate Initiative that it goes up 5% every year. And the technical analysis didn't think we could probably join by 2028, maybe, or somewhere in that time at the earliest. So, 26, 27, 28 in that time frame. So 5% a year, those numbers would go up. So it'd be a sudden sort of impact to the consumer here in Vermont. Because the New York model would start at the beginning and we could get in at the beginning, we'd be starting at a lower level in terms of the immediate price impact. And then that would be felt more gradually over time. So that was one point, was the difference between starting midstream versus starting at the beginning. The other was thinking about New York and the Western climates as partners. If you do have that sudden impact on pricing, Vermont, we're a small state, both geographically and population wise. I grew up in Brattleboro and, know all of the folks that are enticed to go to New Hampshire, Massachusetts for a variety of reasons to do shopping. And, if gasoline prices at the border had that immediate difference in terms of price, it would provide what's called leakage, people leaving Vermont and going to the borders to get their gas, maybe getting other things as well when they're out purchasing gas. So joining New York would at least take away one of the major borders, in Bennington, for example, then that wouldn't be an issue in terms of people going over to Bennington because you have New York and Vermont as partners on this program. So that was one of the other reasons for our analysis. And then the third reason was just overall sort of affordability issues. If you think about where we are in the economy and where we are in Vermont, we've had rising healthcare prices, rising housing prices, property taxes, thinking about general inflation and price impact, thinking about the fact that inflation is not very clear the direction that's heading at this moment. The price increase that we're talking about with the Western Climate Initiative would be a hard pill to swallow for Vermonters at this moment. Now, those are sort of the reasons we thought New York was better, a better partner. A couple of the recommendations that we have, I think, are critical, whether we decide to go with New York down the road or whether the legislature decides to go with the Western Climate Initiative. But I think the primary recommendation is the most important, is trying to think about the mechanism for holding low and moderate income Vermonters whole so that they are not being impacted by this policy, really, hopefully in any way, but certainly in a significant way. We have some different scenarios in our report that sort of show how a cap and trade policy could impact different families. And certainly if you're a family from rural Vermont, if you're a family from Essex County, you're driving much greater frequencies. You likely have older cars that don't have as good a gas mileage. You're not making as much money as on average as folks in other parts of Vermont. So that will have a disproportionate impact. And you may not also be in a position to fund the upfront investments to get the benefit of a program like this out of your own pocket, that is. So I think it's really important for a program, if it could be implemented, to think about how are you going to make sure those Vermonters are protected and that rebate, that sort of money that would go back to a low or moderate income Vermonter happens in real time, or as much in real time as can be, or even ahead of time. And my point on that is, you know, that the family that we sort of hypothetically described in our report potentially pays $1,000 a year extra in gasoline if we join the Western Climate Initiative. So, you know, with all the other expenses that they have and where their incomes are, $1,000 is hard for them to carry. So if a program were established where you sort of filed with your taxes, for example, and got that money retrospectively, I think that'd be really hard for families. You know, if you do the program ahead of time, so you sort of are getting money up front, you don't really know what your energy consumption is going to be for that year. So that's kind of a tricky one as well. We didn't suggest a resolution to that problem here. You know, we had 3 or 4 weeks to sort of think this through, but we definitely wanted to identify that as sort of one of the main challenges, one of the main viability points that needs to be thought through, how to keep low and moderate income Vermonters whole in as real time as possible. Another one of the recommendations that we made in terms of ongoing work that can happen right now is thinking through the funds that are collected. How will they be spent? What is sort of a recommendation around how they will be spent? You know, if we raise $100 million from this program, there's certainly going to be administrative costs that some of that 100 million will need to go toward. You know, maybe it's 5 or 10%. And then how much of that money is going to be used to hold low and moderate income Vermonters whole? You know, let's just call it 40 million. So you have 10 million for administrative, 40 million to hold people whole. And then you have 50 million. And what is that 50 million going to be used for? Is it incentives? Is it climate resiliency? Is it investing in climate or green infrastructure? I think it'd be really helpful to have that, at least in a recommendation, or at least, you know, modeled out in different ways so that the legislature can make the decision. You know, there is clear and important benefit here from this program, and it's worth setting up and worth going through those administrative components. So all that being said, you know, the other thing that we should make sure we highlight is the cap and invest concept we found did have real merit. It can have really important climate benefits. It can have really important economic benefits. There was the TA sort of described, depending on the approach, you know, anywhere between 80 and I think 810 jobs being created, depending on which sort of approach was taken. So there's some potential for job creation. There's potential certainly also for better health outcomes, cleaner air, less asthma, people overall living a better life in Vermont. So I don't mean to discount those. We only, we put those right up in front in our report, actually, the benefits that could come from the cap and invest program. We just think it's important to do it in a way that makes the most sense for Vermont. And I do think looking at the two options available, New York appears to be the better partner, with the other extra point that those two items in particular, figuring out how to keep low and moderate income Vermonters whole in real time, and then also doing an analysis around how would we actually spend the money that's collected so we can understand the benefit, I think are two important homework items as well. So with that, happy to answer, you know, any questions that the committees might have.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate your office taking the time to do this work, and I appreciated the 3 hypothetical families of the Bell, the Sparks, and the Sawyers. It felt like a good framing of the potential 3 groups of people who would be impacted. But what I felt was missing was any conversation of public transportation. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that and how you see us delaying entering a cap and trade program with a floundering public transportation system that it feels like, at least to me, on the brink of being non-functional. And I'm wondering if you could, because there wasn't in any of the scenarios, none of them took public transportation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, certainly I think public transportation options are more plentiful in Chittenden County. Maybe even they're not fulsome enough for every family to be able to utilize. And then there's sort of varying degrees at that point. But I guess the point I would make is if that, whatever the revenue number is that is generated from a cap and invest program, one of the options could be to invest in public transportation. So I think that certainly is consistent with our recommendation, at least to study how to use the money, particularly public transportation outside of Chittenden County.
Thank you.
Representative Todd?
Yeah, I appreciate you being here and the report. Are the reasons that you're suggesting Vermont doesn't join with the Western group the same? Is that why New York also is sort of going it alone? They didn't join the existing group? Do you
Well-
know why they're going it alone?
I would leave it to A&R and the climate office maybe to have more intel on that. But I do know that New York is also considering possibly joining the Western Climate Initiative. I think that is a possibility for them. I think everybody suspects that they'll either go it alone or decide maybe to not. I don't think those are the options. Western Climate themselves, or they just put a pause on it completely. But I think originally the thought was they were going to establish their own program. I presume that maybe New York just thinks they can learn from those states and develop a better program that fits New York better. I think A&R and the climate office would be in a better position to talk about that. But I do think that I would imagine they would share some of the thoughts that we have around starting a program that's already a decade in the making versus starting from scratch and being able to design it in a way that works best for you.
Other questions or comments from anywhere? Well, Treasurer Pujek, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a very quick 2-minute break offline. We have to take I request, I'll take either way.